This is Can You Believe It? Your incredible and informative YouTube channel. Here we make every effort to address complex and not so complex sociological, psychological, and theological issues about life on God's green earth. We believe that all truth is God's truth, whether that truth is found in the social sciences, in mathematics, physics, chemistry, or biology. And our premise is founded on that principle that all truth is God's truth. And our responsibility as scholars is to find it wherever it may be found, analyze it, and share it with all creatures, big and small, on God's green earth. Let's continue with this subject of divorce and marriage. And I want to begin by looking at our main passage where Jesus speaks on the issue of divorce in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9. And this is how the text reads. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason the man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no person is to separate." They said to him, the disciples, that is, or rather the Pharisees, this is what they said. "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." These are the very direct words of Jesus. This passage has led many Christians and churches today to assume policies and to make firm policies around divorce. The text does not leave room for other offenses like abuse or abandonment, as we have read. So the question we want to look at this morning that the Pharisees bring to Jesus is loaded with a lot of cultural and historical baggage that we have to sift through in order to get to what Jesus is really driving at. And remember, as we go, this question was intended to trick or to trap Jesus. These were rabbis, scholars of the law, trying to catch rival rabbi in a philosophical argument. So let's start with Moses. Here, the Pharisees reference Moses' divorce reform. And in Mark's version of this text, of this teaching, Jesus is the one who first brings up the name of Moses. So we better figure out what Moses has to do or had to do with this particular question and then answer it as well. By the time of Moses, the value from the surrounding cultural environment had already displaced God's vision of marriage according to Genesis chapter 2. At the time of Moses, women were viewed as inherently inferior to men, and they were seen as personal property. So Israel's abandonment of God's way had adopted the moral and legal positions found in the Hammurabi Code. The Code of Hammurabi stated that a husband had the right to divorce his wife for any reason he saw fit. Let's dig deep into this. So the husband also reserved the right to change his mind and to come back and claim his ex-wife, his kids, and the estate as his own, again, if he happened to change his mind at any point in the future. So the wife was not only abandoned in this case, but also was powerless, and often she was left financially destitute, unable to get work in our society. So God responded by giving Moses laws regarding divorce that stood in direct opposition to this cruel and patriarchal cultural code that left women high and dry. So in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 5, Moses offers a divorce reform. Whether a man divorced his wife, it had to be in writing. We know that to be the case. The divorce certificate allowed the woman to pursue another marriage if she chose to do so after the divorce. It also kept the husband from changing his mind when his anger passed, and just in case that the woman was remarried. A woman who held a divorce certificate had no obligation to return to her husband, even if her husband, or rather, even if he summoned her back. So the divorce certificate was a reform designed to make men stop and to think twice before breaking their marriage vows. This is according to Moses. And they had to put it in writing. And the certificate also made provisions for the abandoned wife. Deuteronomy mentioned divorce on the grounds of indecency. All right. So in the Hebrew, it read, for the cause of sexual immorality, then a divorce was permissible. This clause in the text in this book of Deuteronomy raises the question, therefore, what about other situations and other cases? Was there any precedent for divorce because of abuse and abandonment? Well, yes. In fact, those cases were covered. In Exodus chapter 21, we find another classic text on divorce. And the law asks, what happens if a man takes a second wife? The text in Exodus answers with provisions of protection, or rather to protect the interests of the first wife. If the husband takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her, that is, the first wife. He shall not diminish her food, clothing, and love. If he does not provide her with those three things, she is free to go without any payments of money. That's Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 through 11. Here we find again, or rather once again, the law of Moses is seeking to protect the women. And in this case, the husband takes a new wife, and of course, human nature being what it is, the new wife tends to get the good stuff. So the law said, when he, meaning the husband or the man, marries his first wife, he made a vow to provide, or rather to support the wife with food and clothing and love. So if he broke or he breaks the law, then the first wife is free to leave and free to get a divorce, free to get a certificate, and free to remarry. Now, over time, the rabbis looked at these two passages found in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and in Exodus chapter 21 as the classical, as the main scriptural text governing the issue of divorce. And they said, based on these texts, marriage, therefore, involves a vow, and those vows included three primary promises. One, fidelity. Second, as found in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Second, provision in Exodus chapter 21. And third, affection. The question therefore becomes, did the rabbis who were questioning Jesus believe that biblical grounds for divorce could include things like abandonment or abuse? Well, the answer is yes, and we're going to look into this. Abandonment was considered the extreme form of breaking the vow of provision. as we've seen from the book of Exodus, chapter 21. And then abuse could be the extreme form of breaking the vow of affection, all right, as we've seen above in the text of Exodus chapter 21. And therefore, in Israel, those would be grounds for divorce. That did not mean that divorce was a good idea, however. It was not. But this was a way of preventing injustice and the suffering of the women when vows were broken by the men. That was the framework for marriage and divorce in ancient Israel. That was the reference to Moses' referendum that both the Pharisees and Jesus are referring to historically in this text found in the book of Matthew. However, in Jesus' time, there was new development. Two of the famous rabbis who had lived a few decades before Jesus was born and who dominated the rabbinical teachings were named Hillel and Shammai. These are the big scholars, the big dogs, and the big law firms of the day, the big two schools of thought amongst the rabbis. Their schools were founded around the interpretation of the law of Moses or the Torah, and in particular, this particular text in Deuteronomy. Hillel looked at the law in Deuteronomy 24, and where Moses says a man can divorce his wife for a cause of sexual immorality. And he reflected on this text. Hillel reflected on this text and said, Moses could have said a man could divorce his wife for sexual immorality, but he included this phrase for the cause of sexual immorality. So the rabbis loved every word and believed that no word was random or spoken with no purpose. And so Hillel reasoned that this word must refer to another cause, which was different grounds for divorce besides sexual immorality, since it was just the word cause that Hillel concluded it must mean any cause. In other words, Hillel argued that in Deuteronomy 24 meant that a man could divorce his wife for two reasons. Number one, sexual immorality, and second, basically any cause. Well, let's look at the facts here. Hillel was a man. The rabbi in his school were men. So they also decided that any cause clause meant that divorce would be available to only men. So Hillel concluded that this any cause divorce would cover just any fault you could conceive of in your wife. And the list of offenses that fell under this any cause provision were things like, let's say, if a wife spoiled or burnt her husband's dinner, he could divorce her. If she walked around with her hair unbound or uncovered the way he wanted, he could divorce her. If she spoke or she argued with him in a voice that he did not like, that voice may have been interpreted as being loud enough so that the neighbors would be heard. He could divorce her. Basically, anything was a reason for the man to divorce their partners. So the clause, any cause divorce, was the irreconcilable, similar to the irreconcilable differences of the ancient world or the irreconcilable differences that we see today. One drawback is that it was very expensive to divorce. If a husband, as it is today, if a husband could prove adultery in court, he was not permitted to pay the marriage inheritance that was promised at the wedding. But if he pursued any cause divorce, the irreconcilable differences, he still had to pay the inheritance fee. But that didn't deter many. As soon as Hillel's school of thought introduced this any cause divorce, it grew like wildfire. Any cause divorce became the most popular form of divorce in all of Israel. So if you recollect, this context sheds light on Matthew chapter 1, verses 19, where Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant with Jesus. And because he didn't want to expose a public disgrace, the Bible says he agreed to divorce her quietly. The word used in Matthew there, quietly, is not just a vague adjective in that particular text in Matthew. It is a technical term that Joseph had decided not to take Mary to court to prove she was guilty of adultery, and thus he wanted to get out of the marriage inheritance. He decided to get an any cost divorce to avoid the scandal. And this was an invention, or rather an interpretation of the Old Testament text in Deuteronomy and Exodus by this famous Jewish rabbi by the name of Hillel. The other popular rabbi of the day was named Shammai. Shammai disagreed with Hillel. He argued, no. Deuteronomy chapter 24 only applies to divorce for sexual immorality. It doesn't throw the floodgates open to every possible cause out there. Shammai would certainly have also agreed that divorce could happen due to abuse and abandonment based on Exodus chapter 21, but the real disagreement was over the interpretation of Deuteronomy 24. Does it mean any cause or adultery alone? Is adultery therefore the only reason a Christian can get divorced? In Jesus' day, there was a huge debate among these rabbis regarding this interpretation. Some were followers of Hillel's interpretation, while others followed Shammai's interpretation. And therefore, the Pharisees coming to Jesus with this question to find out, where does Jesus stand? Is he a follower of Hillel, any cause divorce, or is he a Shammai, whereby only adultery is seen as the only reason? Every rabbi was expected to weigh in on this issue and choose one side or the other. You couldn't be on both. So when the Pharisees are coming to Jesus, they're coming to trap him. They pulled out the most divisive issue of the day. Is it lawful for man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Matthew chapter 19, verses 3. They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were asking. They were basically asking, do you agree with Hillel or Shammai, Jesus, on the interpretation of Deuteronomy 24? But Jesus is sharp. He won't be caught by these sneaky lawyers of the day. Jesus goes on to say that a person can divorce and remarry except for sexual immorality. Matthew 19, verses 9. So Jesus takes a Shammai perspective. Jesus is simply answering a direct question about his stance on these two extreme positions. And Jesus comes down against any cause divorce, or what we call irreconcilable differences approach. Jesus rejects Hillel's interpretation. He's saying, I'm a Shammai guy on this issue. However, as you go into the New Testament, we find Apostle Paul reaching a little bit deeper into this question. Other passages in the New Testament, and specifically Paul's counsel to the church in Corinth, would indicate that divorce was allowed in the case of other breaches of the marriage covenant by one of the spouses. First, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 39, and in Romans chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, the death of a spouse warrants a legitimate ending to the covenant of marriage. Second, adultery. Deuteronomy 22, verses 22, and Matthew verses 5, verses 32, which is part of the covenant of marriage, is that one man, one woman would be one flesh, and adultery is a betrayal of the oneness of the covenant. This does not mean that if adultery is committed, that you must get a divorce, but it means that you may have biblical grounds to do so. Third, sexual immorality. Deuteronomy 24, Matthew 5:32, and Matthew 19, verses 9. This covers a wide range of sexual sins here. The word that is often used in the scriptures is porneia. It is the same root word from which we get the word pornography. And it's a general term meaning all kinds of sexual immorality and sin. And fourth, the betrayal by an unbelieving spouse, found in 1 Corinthians, in the arguments of Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Sometimes a Christian marries a non-Christian, and the non-Christian just leaves at some point in the marriage. Sometimes the two marry, and as non-Christians, one becomes a Christian, and then the other non-Christian says, I did not sign up to be married to a Christian, and then they leave. They file for divorce. There's nothing you can do about that. So, fifth, any other breach of the covenant vows is seen in Exodus 21 or Malachi chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Any breach of safety and loyalty that puts one spouse in danger is initiated in this case, including cases of abuse and abandonment. But the common denominator in all of these instances, except for adultery, is the hardness of heart. And Jesus references this as a main cause, while Moses had to grant the people the certificate of divorce. Starting with Moses, the concession was given to divorce as a last resort in instances of hardness of heart. Hardness of heart violates two primary relationships simultaneously. That's the relationship with the spouse and the relationship with God. And I think this is what Jesus is speaking about in this text. However, let's remember, reconciliation is the primary motivation behind our actions against those who have done harm or greater harm to us. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 11. Because Jesus says we should love our enemies. Matthew 5, verses 43 through 45. The Bible also commands sinners to repent. So, if there's no repentance and a broken heart, then there is no requirement to remain married, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 11. So, are you a Hillel interpreter when it comes to these texts on divorce? Or do you hold to a no-cost divorce or the irreconcilable differences point of view? Or are you a Shammai interpreter? There is nothing new under the sun. This has been Can You Believe It? Your incredible and informative YouTube channel. Here we make every effort to address complex and not so complex sociological, psychological, theological issues, sometimes political, about God's issues, about life on God's green earth. We believe that all truth is God's truth, whether that truth be found in social sciences or in mathematics and physics or in chemistry or biology. Our premise is founded on the basis that all truth is God's truth. And our responsibility as scholars is to find it wherever it may be found, analyze it, and to share it with all creatures, big and small, on God's green earth. This has been Can You Believe It? Remember to subscribe to the channel so you can get informed and get more details and informative and juicy discussions here on our channel. Stay blessed. Thank you.